This is going to be the first of a series of short workshops about bowing. Um, to a lot of people, bowing is the great mystery, getting that drive and that rhythm with your bow. But like a lot of things in fiddling, the closer you get, the more you find out it's a lot easier than you think. In fact, that's just about a rule. A lot of things, fiddling has evolved for 400 years by people who were not trained musicians, and so they naturally evolved everything down to something that had to be simple and efficient, and yet work for dancing and work for expressing feeling. And so you'll find out that when you're struggling and you think something is really hard and how in the world are they doing that, and then once you figure out what they are doing, it turns out to be a whole lot easier than you thought it was. Um, I used to go up and play with a fiddler named Charlie Kinney over in Lewis County, and we would go see, Gus Mead and I would visit Charlie, and we'd play tunes for him, and he'd play tunes for us, and he'd learn tunes off of us, and we'd learn tunes off of him. And one time I was playing a tune for him, and I think I was playing one of the tunes I'd learned from him. And as I was playing, Charlie was just staring at me. And Charlie was kind of an unusual person. He had dark, deep-set eyes and looked like he had some Native American blood. And he kind of lived in another world of his art and his music, and like he was communicating to you from a different planet sometimes. So it was a little disconcerting the way he was staring at me. I thought maybe he was unsatisfied with the way I was playing his tune. But then I noticed what he was looking at was my right hand, and I got done with the tune, and he says, "Here, give me that fiddle." And he played that tune back to me, and he said, "This is what you were doing with the bow." And then he kind of smiled. He says, "I like to catch a feller's bow hand." Well, that's how you do it. I started doing that. I started just zeroing in on watching people's bow hands, and I couldn't explain what they were doing, but I could see it, and so I would imitate it. And I think that's how people learn. That was the visual element of learning. You acquire an ear for tunes to where you can hum them over in your head, and you can get them in your head note for note. You just hear all those notes, but you also have the visual thing of how they use their bow. So I started doing that. And another time I was up there, Charlie said something else that really stuck with me. He said, every piece has a different bow, meaning every tune, you got to bow every tune in a different way and use your bow in a different way in different parts of the tune. And I notice a lot of people these days, they have one or two bow licks that they just do over and over, and no matter what the tune is, they're kind of imposing their bow lick onto a tune. There's the common ones in the 1950s in the bluegrass world. Everybody was into that shuffle, and then a lot of people use a 1-3 where you play one note on the down bow and slur 3 on the up bow. That's a pretty handy lick. A lot of people use that Tommy Jarrell syncopated shuffle, which is a great lick. But I think where you want to go with your fiddling is where the best fiddlers, in my opinion, were, which is they didn't have just a pattern. They were conforming their bowing to the tune and where the tune wanted to take them. And so that's been my approach. And of course, all fiddlers who teach in a different way and they hear certain things and emphasize certain things because that's probably how they learn. And so when I try to show people what I'm doing, really, all I'm doing is show them the way that I learned from the people I learned from, and they were all different. So I'm going to start this bowing discussion with what I think is the simplest and the best way to start, and that is basic sawing. Kentucky fiddlers tend to, I think in general you could say Kentucky fiddling is largely based on sawing and with a little bit of slurring. And so to me it all boils down to those two things, which I think is kind of simple if you think about it. There's two things you can do with your bow. You got 4 notes or 8 notes. You can saw every one of them. Just change bow direction for every note. Or you can put some slurs in there in different places. Slur 2, 3, 4 notes at a time. But the way you put that all together is how you achieve your style. So try to think of it as pretty simple. Sawing and slurring. Those are the only two things you got to worry about, and just putting those things together. But I think you want to base it first on sawing. And so what I'm going to suggest right now is take some tunes that you know and practice sawing your way through them where you saw every note. And you'll find that's not as easy as it sounds. It sounds primitive, but to keep that momentum going through a tune and play all the notes is actually a little bit demanding. But there are some tricks you can use. And then later in another workshop, we'll talk about fitting the slurs in there. But as far as sawing goes, I confess I'm an up bow player, so I start most things on the up bow, so you probably won't want to do that. But early on, I was exposed to a lot of fiddlers who were up bow, so first stroke is up, the next one's down. Yours will be just the opposite probably. It doesn't matter. So Darley Fulks was an up bow player. Several other people I noticed then were. They're in a minority, but those were the ones that I met first. There were a few of them in Kentucky. So here's a passage from Arkansas Traveler, which you're probably familiar with. And I'm going to saw my way all the way through it, changing bow direction for every note, starting on the F sharp. And I'm not saying you're going to want to be a saw fiddler who just saws every note. This is just an exercise to get your bow staying in that forward momentum longer than you want it to. A lot of people, as soon as something gets a little bit difficult, they'll throw some slurs in there where they aren't needed, and they kind of lose the momentum. But to keep that sawing going, okay, first of all, a couple things about sawing. If you play below the middle of the bow close to the frog, you can do it, but it's going to sound choppier because you got a little more of you got to think more about the balance of your bow. I can do that, but you see it's a little choppier. So when you're sawing, you want to be in the upper half of your bow. Bob Prater, who was a great saw fiddler, played right on the tip of his bow so he could get his whole arm going into it and really get a lot of momentum and not have to worry about balance. But there was a time where his bow, he was so close to the tip that his bow went under his bridge. You don't want to do that. But sort of in the top half of your bow, like right in there, then your bow balances right, and it's easy to do those short little loose wrists, just back and forth, relaxed but smooth, keeping your bow straight, because you're bowing every note. But here's something that you'll run into. if I want to saw every note, sometimes you're going to end up at the end of a phrase, your bow's going to be going the wrong direction. So the forward direction for me is up bow. I want to keep getting back to that up bow. For you, it'll be forward, will be down bow, but sometimes you end up going the wrong direction. So here's what you do if you're trying to increase your sawing. I slurred there. I ended on an up bow, so to keep going up bow, I gotta start back with some slurs. I had to go back to a slur to get down bow so I could start going up bow again. So here's what you can do. And this is an important trick. Double that last note. And that gets me, then I can keep going. That extra note there, that extra note lets me keep going up bow when I start over again. So the idea there is doubling notes. And you'd be surprised if you listen close how much of that there is in fiddling, where you just double a note, often at the end of the phrase, but it can be in the middle of a phrase. And the only purpose, it doesn't do anything to the melody, the only purpose of it is to keep your bow moving and keep the rhythm going. And I was fascinated with bowing, and I would talk to a lot of fiddlers about what they were doing, and they could never explain what they were doing. But the one thing that they would often say, and I heard this from a number of fiddlers, they just say, well, just keep your bow moving, keep your bow moving. And I finally figured out what that meant, and that's just keep your bow moving in that saw rhythm, even though you don't have another note to go there, but just you double notes. And that's a good way to keep that momentum going. So practicing on this. Right there. That double note there at the end keeps you going forward to start over. So I think that's a good exercise for bowing fluency. So we'll work on that, and then the next time I'll talk about how to fit some slurs in there, and we'll see how many of these we can get in.